Hello there, and welcome to MusicID, or Music Industry Data. To get started, we're going to stare at this boring static screen here for just a moment while I tell you what this video is, and then we will get going with the actual demonstration. So this video is a pretty thorough demonstration of our platform, MusicID. It's the same demo that I do live for people all the time, so this will be just as if we were on a Zoom call together. And since you can't stop me to ask questions, if there's anything that is not clear or is not covered, you're certainly welcome to get in touch with me or the team. As you might have seen, the video is divided into chapters to help you find your way through. You can look at that to look ahead to see what we're covering. And of course, if you need to revisit anything, hopefully this will help you find it. And first, just let me also apologize in advance if there's any weird background noise. I am recording this live in New York City, so any flubs or random car alarms or sirens in the background, let me apologize now so that I'm not stopping to do that throughout the video. But let's get into the meat of the demonstration. So what we're looking at here is the homepage for our platform, MusicID. And MusicID itself is 3 modules: data, revenue, and impact. So what exactly are these things? What can you get from them? In the demo, I'll cover what they are, the basics of how to use it in terms of functionality, and the basics of how to use it in terms of some of the academic applications or disciplines that our data might be relevant to. So at its core, MusicID is an archive of global record chart data. You can see a summary of that here on the homepage. This particular page is actually a little out of date, but our main website, MusicID Hub, which is just the forward-facing company informational website, that is kept up to date. So if you need to know anything about how many countries, how many years, etc., we have all the information available. So the data platform itself goes back to 1944, and then through revenue and impact, we go back to 1900. So we have historical data for the United States, which is Billboard, official charts company for the United Kingdom, ARIA for Australia, Germany, Sweden, France, Japan, and so on. And we also have contemporary streaming platforms, including YouTube, Apple Music, iTunes, and Shazam. You have 2 choices. So to get started, you can either do a keyword search or a date search. But just to give you the lay of the land of what information we have and how it's presented, let's do a keyword search. So I'll do Nirvana because that's relevant to the case study I'll show you here in a little bit. So the keyword search will give you any hit for the word in an artist or a recording title, so the albums or singles. As you can see, there's several different bands that have Nirvana in the name. The actual Nirvana that we all know and either love or hate is here. You'll see that they all say United States, but don't worry about that because the system basically just makes us put in something there. It can't be empty, but it's not limited to the United States. You will get all countries available when you click on any of these. And this is also a good example here, this Jesus Lizard / Nirvana, of some of the disambiguation that's needed as things are reported by labels or by the chart companies. So we've mediated in it a little bit to make things easier to find, but in some cases you'll find that collaborations are indexed separately from the main artist. So just be aware of that as you're searching. If you were to go to the Billboard website, for example, that's what you would find this under. So we've done our best to consolidate, but we also don't want to completely undo things as they have it. And then likewise here in albums and singles, you can see a number of things that have Nirvana in the name. And here you can choose as many of these as you'd like, but we'll go to the artist to have a look at that. So now we're looking at the artist discography page for Nirvana. As you can see at the top, we have a graph with 3 items on it. The system will automatically select the top 3 things here in the table, so you have something to look at. So you can take these out or put anything else that you'd like into it. I'll go over in more detail what's actually in the graph here and how to work with that. But first, let me show you what's in the page. So scrolling down, you have a table in the main view here. And then on the left, you have another navigational bar, basically. So this tells you the artist, the format. So we're looking at albums. We could also look at singles and the countries. So if you scroll down this, you will see all of the countries in which this artist has charted. So for Nirvana, that's probably pretty much all of them, which currently I believe is 124. The number keeps growing as iTunes and so on grow throughout the world. So this can be an interesting way to see some of the listening habits of small countries. But I'll get into that again later on. And then as you see here, you can limit by peak position. So for example, if you only want to know albums that got into the top 10, I can do that, and then that makes it a much shorter list. And one of the most important things here would be export data. So if I click this, you will get a spreadsheet, just a basic text, almost CSV file of the information that is in this table. So whatever you're looking at is what you'll have in the document. So if you want everything on the page, you want to make sure that you select all. Now that right there, for me, is worth the price of admission, because that gives you like the full history of albums in the United States. If I want the full history of albums in these other countries, let's look at, for example, the United Kingdom, which is Great Britain here because of dumb technical reasons. So you can see it's a shorter list, but still pretty thorough. So instead of having to go to these individual publisher websites, look at the list, hand copy, click individually on everything, you've got a good summary here. That saves, at least has saved me as an academic, tons of time. But let's go over what we're actually looking at in the table. So I went back to the United States, and as you can see, by default, this table is sorted by the chart, but you can reorder by any of these columns. So if I want to look alphabetically by the title, I can do that. I can go from the oldest. You can also do peak position and weeks in chart. I use these a lot. But let's not belabor this table too much, and let's go into a date search, and we'll get into more of the details with that. So instead of going back to the home page, which you could do by clicking here, you can just go up to the upper right corner to do a date search. Now, the date search will basically give you an individual day in a chart, as if you were opening up a Billboard magazine on that particular date. And you kind of go in reverse order. So you'll start with the day. In this case, let's go to 7th of December, 1991. If I keep scrolling down, you can see we go back to 1944. And then once you've limited that, you'll see the country list get shorter. So because this is pre-digital, we only have a handful of countries that were publishing charts at the time. For today, we want the United States. And then here you can see the charts that are available for that, which are mostly Billboard. We have, if I haven't said already, we have 120 charts from Billboard. But just so that you're aware, if you don't know the record charts, Billboard is really the flagship of all this. They started really the whole thing of record charts, but they do cover the whole world. So now we are looking at a day in chart. As you can see, the actual view is the same, but the data here will be a bit different. The left side, as always, tells you what you're looking at. So the chart is the Billboard 200, the date, December 7th, 1991, and how many positions of the chart, which is 10. So by default, it only loads the top 10 just to save on the loading time, but you can expand up to however many you'd like here. And just the same as with the artist discography page, click export data to get the text table of what you're looking at. So this again is a thing that's a big advantage over the publisher websites such as Billboard or OCC, Official Charts Company, because you can't just click and save the whole thing. You can copy and paste or save the website, but it's a bit messier. So especially if if you need the actual text for granular analysis, for data science, for things like that, if you have Python libraries you're managing, then this is a lot more convenient. And then here in the table, so the table is the chart itself, starting with the top 10 positions. As with everything else, you can reorder, but if I reorder it, it's only going to be what I'm looking at. So like if I click here, then it's of these 10, what had the fewest or the most weeks in chart. It's not the full 200. So just remember, you're only working with what you got loaded, not with the full chart. Let's go back to peak position. And I did it again. I do this all the time in choosing the wrong date. So I'm actually going to unselect these and go to the next week. It's the week after this. I always think of December 7th because that was my dad's birthday, or is my dad's birthday, I should say. So December 14th, here's where the real magic happens. All right, I'll put the top 3 back in. So to start off, let me tell you a little bit about the graph and the functionality here. So the table that we're looking at, even though this is just the one day in the chart, it's pretty much the same as if you were looking at the Billboard website, and that you have the summary here. For this week, Michael Jackson's Dangerous is in position number 1. It's the first week that it entered the chart, so it doesn't have a previous position. As you might have seen before I skipped to the correct date, Garth Brooks' Rope in the Wind was number 1 last week, so you can see U2, Octoon Baby was number 1 last week. It is now number 3. It has peaked at number 1. And then this is not weeks in chart to date. This would be the total weeks in chart. So just be aware of that distinction. And you might have seen stream count here also. It's blank because this is not a streaming chart, but if you were looking at Spotify chart, it would have the streams here. So the table is giving us the snapshot of one day. On this day, December 14th, Dangerous was number 1, but when we scroll up, the line is much longer. We're looking at the full history. So for me, I'm pretty visual, and I find this to be kind of the most engaging feature, because you can't access this through any other publisher website. So if you want to have an idea, like, if you're looking at this chart, you'd think, okay, well, cool, it started at number 1, but, how successful was it? You can see on the Billboard website the same thing. It was in the chart for 119 weeks, but what happened in that? Were they good? Were they bad? Did it crater? And then here, when you look at this sort of a cornflower color, you can see exactly what happened. So instead of having to go week by week by week by week by week in the Billboard website, I swear I'm vaguely traumatized from doing that. It's so tedious. Here you have all of it. So if you just want an idea of it, then there you go. The other nice thing about the visualization is it shows you some events in the life of the artist or of the recording. So if you compare, for example, if you mouse over these, you'll see what you're looking at. So if you forget what the color is, don't worry. This cornflower color is Michael Jackson, the aqua is U2, and the purple is Garth Brooks. You can see with the U2 and the Garth Brooks that they all started high and then they taper off. So they have pretty similar shape, even though the Michael Jackson actually tapered off sooner. But there's you can see a pretty drastic difference in the two lines. These taper off organically as they just, like anything, there's a lot of sales at first. Interest tapers off because everyone who wants it has already bought it. But the Michael Jackson one has a huge peak. So that tells you that something happened to put the artist or their recording back into the media to make people discover it again and then go out and buy it again. Or listen to it on the radio, all of these sources from which the charts are calculated. So looking at the platform itself, our system will not tell you what that event was, but for example, I just went and Googled See, this is the date as it's peaking here. It's February 1993. I just Googled February 1993 Michael Jackson to see what that was. And as it turned out, that was when he did the Super Bowl halftime show. Now, that was actually the first time the Super Bowl had ever had a huge pop artist do the halftime show. In the past, it had always been people who were, I guess, cheaper to get, like old Motown artists. It was more nostalgic, marching bands, things like that, that were not necessarily meant to bring in a non-football audience. But I suppose they figured they'd give it a shot. And so they hosted Michael Jackson. As you can see, that was immensely beneficial to his sales. And as you know from the history of the Super Bowl, it was immensely beneficial to the NFL. So they continue to attract big name artists, and it's a big deal. Because at the time that I'm recording this is all the controversy around Bad Bunny has cropped up, because he was just announced, I think about a week ago, as the halftime show. So as you might know, especially in the United States, it's causing some controversy because of political reasons. I won't editorialize, but it's an interesting subject every year to see reactions to the halftime show. But that's an aside. So there's a little peek into how you can use it through different research interests. But over the years and looking at this, all these different little peaks, like those were probably singles. I actually haven't looked those up, but these other little valleys, those are also telling you that it's basically the news cycle. You know, this was before the 24-hour news cycle with CNN. So it's kind of interesting to see that reflected here. This particular spike is actually when Michael Jackson first had a lawsuit brought against him. Tapered off, so that helped his visibility and sales. And then all these little humps are actually when the trial got underway, and so these are just like different cycles of reporting on that hearing. And before we move into the case study, let's go over what we're actually looking at here in the graph and how to use it. I'll take one of these things out just to make it a little bit simpler. So when I did that at reset, that's good to see. This long line is a little weird looking, but basically that just means there was nothing in this chart through all of that span of time, but there was one blip, December 12th, 2009, that the album came back into the Billboard 200 for that 1 week. And just as I was saying, that tells you something about current events. So in this case, that's actually when Michael Jackson died. But sometimes if there was a really successful ad campaign, you'll see something come back for like 1 week or 2 weeks. But anyway, let's go over what we're actually looking at here. The y-axis automatically scales to what you're looking at, and then you have the years on the bottom. The upper right tells you the date range that the data covers, so that's January 1st, 1991 to July 17th, 2010. And if I were to, let's say, zoom in, you just click and drag to zoom on that. You can see in the upper right the date range has changed, and then this orange bar is showing sort of the window that's been limited to. So if you can also click and drag this. So like if I know I just want to go back out a little bit, I can just drag that. Otherwise, I could go up here to all to fully reset, or I can, limit to 3 months. So it's from the latest date is always what this is. So this is a bad example here, but we go back to all. When I click and drag to zoom in, you can see that the y-axis automatically scales to fit. So the lowest position we're looking at is 149. So this is scaled down to 175 to make it a little bit easier to see. But you can also manually limit this with this menu right here. So if I want to look at the top 10, that makes it a lot easier to see swaps and changes in the top 5 to 10 positions, which is of interest to a lot of marketing questions especially, or reception issues. And then lastly, I will go back out to all and back to automatic. I'll stick another couple of things in there just to give us some more stuff. So the default view you can see selected as sales ranking. That's chronological. I'm not entirely sure why it says sales ranking, but chronological versus absolute are your options. So there you can see they come in like the olive starts here, the dark purple starts here. I'll zoom in so you can see more clearly. Yeah, these are staggered. If I wanted to see just point by point, apples to apples, which one of these did better, I can do absolute, and that puts them all on the same start date. And then you can see exactly, line by line, which one was in one for longer, and so forth. I'm going to take these back out, go back to all, and now let's cover some of the, in this case, maybe musicological issues that you can look at with this. So we had a colleague doing a project on the rise of grunge and alternative music in the 90s, taking over the conventional pop music that was kind of enduring from the 80s. The Nirvana album Nevermind, of course, is a huge, famous example because it came out of absolutely nowhere. It had, I think, literally no marketing budget. But as you can see with the hot pink line, it did well enough through word of mouth. I think basically the band had been playing at festivals and stuff. They were getting good reviews of their live shows, these things, in magazines and newspapers. Little by little, they gained reputation. So then over the course of the year, they got some attention. Their album came out in, I believe, September, because the first charted date here is October of 91, and pre-digital era, it took 2 to 4 weeks, I think, for things to make it into the charts, because of course everything had to be reported and tallied and blah, blah, blah. So a lot of times that date is not the actual date that it came out. And in the case of Nirvana, let's zoom in. So it first charted in October, and then little by little, finally here in, oh, sorry, I'm looking at absolute. So there's a good example. That limits the data that you have when you hover. So first, October 12th, and then bit by bit, they creep up the chart into the top 10 in December, and then dun, 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 they overtake Michael Jackson on January 11th, 1992 to reach number 1. So that's a really famous cultural and kind of music industry / marketing example of how a thing can become immensely successful without any money behind it. And it makes a really great contrast with this Michael Jackson album, Dangerous, because at the time that it was released, it was actually the biggest marketing campaign ever in the history of music releases. I can't remember the budget for it, but it was something insane for the time, like $50 million. I'm thinking of the number 50 because it was either 50 million or it was simultaneously released in 50 countries at the same time. So don't quote me on the numbers there, but I do know for a fact it was the biggest campaign. So as you would expect, that album opened at number 1, stayed at number 1, but then tapered off. And let's go back and add these things to it. I'll take the Nirvana out for a second. And let's go back to absolute so we can really, I should have done that first. So we can really just do the apples to apples. So again, the Michael Jackson is the cornflower. The olive is MC Hammer. So of course this is, a fad, one-hit wonders kind of situation. And then Garth Brooks and U2 are certainly much more enduring. This Garth Brooks album was actually the first time a country album had opened at number 1, or I guess reached number 1, in the main Billboard 200 chart, not just in the country chart. So, of course, he'd been doing well in the country charts for a long time, but this is when he became a nationwide sensation. So for the fad thing, MC Hammer, as you can see, very successful at first, and then boop, it dies. Weirdly, it follows the same trajectory as the Michael Jackson, but since his career basically died then, I think partly because of his financial difficulties, he he didn't get the benefit of Super Bowl shows and other things to boost his profile. So that's really interesting to compare that Michael Jackson, who of course was the king of pop, one of the most successful person since Elvis, certainly at the time, worldwide and domestically. If they could have spent nothing on the album and he would have opened at #1, and then they spent tons and tons of money, and did it pay off? Maybe if you look globally, you can see some information there, but I'll leave it to a better economic and marketing mind than mine to figure that out. But my instinct, or my impression, is that it was not worth the money. He was already a cultural touchstone, so... And these other two things, you can see, actually outperformed it. I don't know anything about their marketing budgets, but... so there is an example of how you can use the platform to look at some of these issues of reception, media studies, music business, marketing, and so on. Not just for research purposes, but also you could assign this to students. A lot of classes, especially music business, have students go to the most recent day in a chart, go to last week's chart, pick a song and talk about it. And then, of course, whatever you're talking about will depend on the class. But it's also somewhat popular among business and math and economic professors at just kind of a 101 level to teach some basic skills, because it's a more interesting set of data for students to work with. So if you want to teach some basic questions of consumer choices or statistics, and what's the rate of decay in these things over time and so on, you can give them some boring reports from transportation records, like airplanes, like train spotting basically, or census reports, economic reports, or you can have them engage with something that they are actually interested in, which is probably current music. Guarantee most of the people in class, if you tell them look up your favorite artist and pick 5 things and give me something interesting about it for this lesson, they will be a lot more engaged with it than some other things. But to go back to finish up some of the musicology angle of this, we'll put Nevermind back in. Go back to sales ranking. Okay, so this is the famous rivalry here, pop versus alternative. Similarly here, if we look at the Nirvana, the Pink, huge peaks and valleys that are very unexpected, tells you something happened, something pretty major to get that level of spike. And in this case, that was actually because the lead singer killed himself. As you know, if you've at all familiar with the band, death, unfortunately, is very good for business in the arts, so that kept them pretty current in the charts for the remainder of the decade, really. So this is the main battle, alternative versus especially grunge, that kind of alt-rock sound. But there's all these different genres, as we've already looked at, like MC Hammer and Garth Brooks. And so somebody was looking at this chart and saw this Metallica here and thought, well, heavy metal, thrash metal, they are probably more niche, so let's just see how they do. Just curious. If you're looking at the columns here, you've already got a preview that there's some unexpected events maybe in our assumptions. But if we go back up, you can see that this thing that you might presume would be more niche, is the brown here, is the Metallica. It was actually wildly more successful, arguably, than both of these other things. So I couldn't tell you if, as a whole, heavy metal sold more than grunge or pop in the 90s. So this is just one album, but it gives you an interesting discovery that you can then take to other avenues of research and inquiry. This particular album, I do know, was Metallica's most successful by far. This one, I believe, this is their self-titled album, Metallica, which is called the Black Album. It was, I think, 16 times platinum, and they've had a few others that were multi-platinum into double digits, but the other ones, as you might expect, were a little more niche. But maybe based on this data, we could challenge a narrative of the 90s as an alt-rock era. Maybe there's some other narratives that we're missing, so that's just something that we can interrogate and find out if this assumption is true or not. the last thing to cover here with a graph would be probably the export graph button. I forgot to mention that before. That will give you a JPEG of what you're looking at with a key of the lines, the color and the label, so you don't have to mark that separately. That's really useful for presentations or papers. And there's one more thing I'll cover with the functionality here before we move on to the other modules. So let me backtrack. So from here, we're looking at one day in the chart. If you're thinking, well, Metallica, for example, let's not do them because they have a million results and I don't want it to take too much time to load. So Garth Brooks, so this album of his was massively successful. You might be thinking, well, did he have any others that were huge hits in the US or anywhere else? So to answer that question, you'll just click on the name of the artist. That'll take you to the discography page. Or let me go back. Actually, we can do peak position. He's had several #1 albums. Rope in the Wind, compilation, Scarecrow, The Chase, Sevens, and Pieces. I don't know anything about him really, other than what I absorbed in the air as a child, but yeah, certainly very popular. But let's go back. If I want to know how this album did in other countries, I can click on the title of it, and that will load other things. So actually, he was pretty limited at the time. That's not too surprising, but I bet modern country artists, as much as it's spread, have a lot more, or probably some of his newer albums. So that's a way you can get around. And let's actually go back to Garth Brooks here. And in the reverse, let's say you're looking at his discography and this album, Fresh Horses, if you want to know, look at the actual chart. What else was in the chart at the time? Click on the chart name, Billboard 200, and that will take you to the day that this album entered the chart. So in this case, that's December 9th, 1995. So I was just showing you how you can compare something in different countries. So for example, this Mariah Carey Daydream, I know it'll be more successful. Yeah, especially Germany, of course. Great Britain, Germany, obviously huge. She comes up, of course, in every Christmas chart everywhere, every year, but especially in the UK, because they take their Christmas season very seriously for Christmas tunes. But that's just showing me this album. So let's say I want to compare a bunch of random stuff, like other Christmas albums. If I want to look at singles like her oh my goodness, fortunately I've just purged the name from memory, but it's something obvious like It's Christmas. If I want to compare it to some other songs, or albums, then I can use this plus sign to add it to a clipboard. So this is how you can compare things across artist, time, and countries. So let's say I want to look at, what's a good example here? We'll go back to Mariah. I want to look at Mariah Carey on 5 different countries on one chart. How do you do that? The plus sign is how you do that. Okay. So let's go to Germany, because we're first up in the alphabet. If I want to look at here, Daydream, Butterfly, let's pick Great Britain, Daydream, Butterfly. So that's just enough to get us started. If I want to look at these things together in one graph, because as you've seen here, so far we're just looking at this one country. If I click View on a new graph, it basically makes a custom search out of everything that you just put on the clipboard. So this is a really, really useful way to compare the specific items of interest. Like if you wanted to go, like the Metallica question, I said I don't know if other heavy metal albums or other Metallica albums did as well versus other things that were insanely successful, like Nevermind, the Nirvana album. Then this is one way you can look at that. Put those albums in the clipboard and then you can compare them piece by piece. So if I wanted to look at 5 Nirvana albums versus 5 Metallica albums from the same years, I can do that. So it's very quick and easy. The same with before. Export data will give you a table of what you're looking at right here. So this is a good way to collate the data you actually want. You don't have to export the full list and then just pick out the pieces. You can tailor it down to exactly what you need. The other really useful thing for the clipboard that I use a lot is it's kind of like a holding pen for the different things that you're looking between. So if you're looking at some different issues or some different albums or artists that are maybe not relevant together, you don't need to compare them, but you don't want to go back and forth from searching for Nirvana versus searching for Michael Jackson over and over again. Just pick the things you want, stick them in the clipboard. You can have as many things as you want here. Sometimes I have 50, and you can easily deselect all of them that way. So that way, instead of doing a new search over and over and over again, stick it all here, and then you got the stuff that you want. And when you come back to this, as long as you haven't totally closed the browser and reset your computer, restarted the computer, this will still be here. So you can come back to it later tomorrow and resume with the same recordings without having to totally start over. So that covers data. Let's pause here, and then when we regroup, I'll show you revenue and impact and how they take the information from data and then expand on it. Before we move on to revenue and impact, I'd like to give one postscript to the data section of one thing I forgot to go over. So I'm going to zoom in on this little bit. It doesn't matter what this is. I went back to a Nirvana example, but this is just for the sake of example with the screen. So you can see across the bottom there are it's gotten actually so localized that we have calendar days, but on the bottom you have years. And as you can see, as I mouse over these years, there's this little tag popping up that says world events and then the a 4-digit year, so 1996. If you click on this and then another tab, it will open basically a summary of stats about the world and significant news from that time. So we have put this together from various sources online. And as you can see, it has world events at the top, US statistics, some major sporting events. For example, here, I have put in the Super Bowl halftime shows, since that is super relevant to entertainment. And as you go down, we have entertainment awards, science awards, and news, and then also notable deaths of public figures. So if you want just a quick reference for something, or want to work this into lessons in your classroom, then this can be a handy resource. So let's move on now to revenue. To get to it easily, simply go back to the logo in the upper left corner, which will take you to the home page, and then you can navigate here. It's easy to miss since they are gray, but just to remember there. Or if you look here at the address bar, then you just tack the name of the module in front of the domain. So revenue.musicid, etc., or impact.musicid. Now, if data is the most granular of the three modules, then revenue would be somewhere in the middle, and impact is the most global. Revenue features global calculations. You don't get into country-specific data, but you can get somewhat granular within that data. And what actually is the data? So as the name suggests, this is a calculation of revenue brought in by artists and recordings. It's our own original calculation. The units are given in what we have here labeled as indicative revenue. We can't and really shouldn't call it a particular currency because it's really just less precise and misleading. So take this number and multiply it by 5,000, and then you'll have a US dollar amount of how much money the particular thing in question has brought in. So the homepage right now is giving you just a snapshot of top albums. It rotates out. Sometimes it's songs, sometimes it's artists. You can see those are the three categories. And by our calculations, currently Eminem's Curtain Call, a hits compilation, is the most commercially successful album of the 21st century. That's another important detail. You can see here in the upper right corner, the span of years covered within revenue is 2000 to 2024. Simply because one of the primary sources we use for this, the IFPI, the International Phonographic Institute reports, are not available before 2000. But it makes an easy marker to remember. So if I say for all time, I'm referencing this, just remember, I mean for the 21st century. I keep saying of all time, so it just means of all the span of years represented here. It's updated through 2024. We don't have anything yet for 2025 because the year, of course, is not yet over. And before I go over what's on the screen, I'd like to just point out, if you want to know more about the algorithm and how exactly we arrived at this number, go to the star here, the About page, and you can see that there's a very detailed explanation of the sources, how they're weighted, some of the numerical weightings given to the algorithm, and so on. So it's very transparent if you'd like to check behind anything, and if you have the math skills, unlike me, then please do dig into that. So let's review what we're actually looking at here. Starting on the right side, this is what you're here for, is the indicative revenue. So again, multiply this number by 5,000 and you have a US dollar amount. To the left of that is peak positions, which is just kind of a preview of relevant chart positions that were used in the weighting. If you scroll down the columns here at a glance, you can see France is frequently an outlier, as we'll also see a little bit of an impact. So Eminem, for example, even though he has brought in tons of cash, #1 almost across the board, but 141 was his peak position in France for this album. Whereas Adele is pretty much universally adored, apparently. So the Francophones continue to have their own idiosyncratic taste, and we love them for it because we need to have some different tastes in different countries, for sure. To the left of the peak positions, these dates are basically the relevant, or the statistically relevant dates for what features into the chart. It might not be the only dates this thing has been in the charts, but this is what's used in the calculations. The homepage, like I said, is just kind of like the top 20. It's kind of a preview, but if you click these links in the top, you'll get the full variety of things. So for top albums, basically each level has 1,000 items. Right now we're looking at the full ranking of the full 24 years. So the #1 album, as we have already established, of the full time is this Eminem compilation. And if you click this arrow, you can keep going through 200 by 200 until you've reached the full 2000. You can go also into individual years by clicking on the links or use this drop-down menu, choose a year. So for 2009, the top album of that year, we have Lady Gaga's The Fame, and that one brought in, let's see, 41,386 units of indicative revenue, so certainly less money than what's brought in the creme de la creme, as you could say. So I'd say creme de la creme is a good way to think about the revenue module. So we don't have the revenue figures for absolutely everything in the charts that would be in data. That would be an impossible data set to accomplish and then to store somewhere. So this is the top percentage of the top percentage, basically. And I forget the exact figures offhand, but as with a lot of countries' economies and wealth distribution right now, the top 10% or so of the artists in the charts account for something like 80 or 90% of all of the revenue brought in by the industry. So it is so heavily concentrated into these mega successful things. But the point of the revenue module is commercial success and what is most successful of the things that are successful, which would be anything that made it into the charts. So it's purely, commercial value, not critical value or cultural value. So just bear in mind, we've sometimes had criticisms that it's limited, but yes, it is limited. So critical thinking, of course, will come from you. This is simply a set of numbers that you can use in your own evaluations. But returning to the navigation, we're looking at 2009. If I go up, click these arrows, and you can go year to year. You can also, looking back at this menu, choose individual months. So for 2011, our top album was Adele's 21. If you pick a random month, April, it's number one. It's probably going to be number one all the way through. Yeah. And then you can also choose specific days. So personally, I don't use this very much, but it can be useful if you want to look at something like this album came out on a Friday, and in the week after that, how much money had it brought in? And I'll show you shortly here how you would actually get those numbers. And then if you want to zoom back out any levels, then you can click the month, and that will give you the option. That'll take you back to the full year, so you can choose an individual month. Or likewise, select the year, and then you'll go back to the full ranking of everything, and you can choose another year. Songs here is exactly the same as albums, only of course it would be singles. And then artist would be just a list of rankings for catalogs as a whole. And let me add here, because I don't think I've clarified yet, when we say revenue, we do mean across the value stream. It is not what was brought in by this individual artist. So Taylor did not take in X amount of dollars. This is what is the whole pie. So I'm just drawing a circle with my mouse cursor. So the revenue, the indicative revenue figure would be everything. And so then Taylor Swift, for example, would have taken whatever percentage of that, and then the rest would be divvied up among the other people who have a finger in the pie. And it's also important to note that the revenue figures are only income generated by these recordings. So there is nothing concerning sync licensing, concerning tours, merchandise, and other promotional partnerships, things like that. So it is purely what the actual recording did in sales. So now that we've gotten the lay of the different categories, let's get into the real fun in revenue, which is the individual artist and recording pages. So let's go to Eminem. I love this example because he spans the full stretch of time that we're looking at, which again would be since the year 2000. And each artist or recording page will look the same. It's going to have a histogram at the top and then a table below. So this histogram is showing you albums in blue and then singles in green. And this one on the main artist page is the cumulative total of everything. And in each of these histograms, there's a link to an explanation of how we arrived at it, and then also a link to download the data behind it. So the data, similar to the data module, will give you just a simple text spreadsheet, basically week by week. I believe it's actually 60 weeks, not 52, just to make it an easy division of 12. But you can think of it as week by week numbers of revenue figures for the year. And in each of these humps, as I said, is cumulative. So for example, here in 2002, the text is giving you some kind of signpost of things that were released. So we have the Eminem show earlier in the year, like a beginning second quarter maybe, and then 8 Mile at the end of the year. So each of these spikes will, in this plot, will include any album sales at all. If you want to know what piece of the pie came from these particular recordings, then we can scroll down to the list. So we have the albums list and then the songs list. And if I choose a recording, let's go to 8 Mile. Then here the histogram is showing you just the revenue for this particular recording. As you can see, the most significant revenue was right at the beginning, the year in which it was released, and then a little blip here in 2004. I wouldn't be surprised if that's when it came out to video or DVD. As with the main page, you can get the data for the plot. So download that. You can get the numbers of the revenue brought in by this, and then you can just take that as a percentage out of the totals for the same time span or whatever time span in the cumulative data, and then you can see exactly what percentage of the total is brought in by each individual recording. And the fact that the rest of this is blank doesn't mean that it sold nothing. It just means that it wasn't enough to be statistically significant in our calculations. And similarly, you can see that not all of these are linked, and that's partly just because we can only have so much information stored on a server. But also, if I look at, for example, this one, Godzilla, the last single that has a graph, it's just this little blip here in 2020. So some of the others, so Godzilla, that's got 5,054 units of indicative revenue. As we go down, some of these, like this collaboration with Beyonce, number 36, that brought in 1,341. So that would be such a tiny smudge on the graph that it's really not worth looking at. I haven't noticed this before, Rap God here. So this, as an aside, before I go back to the histogram, this is maybe a nice example of particular applications of data. So as I said before, revenue is really, it's just looking at the commercial success of something. It has nothing to do with critical value or cultural relevance. We'll get to more of that in impact. So Rap God, if you are not familiar with it, is I think the Guinness World Record holder for most words per minute in a song. I don't know if it's a rap song or any song, but if you go and listen to it, it is quite an impressive performance. So whether you like the music or like Eminem or not, I guarantee you will at least be impressed by the man's ability to get his mouth around words quickly. As you can tell after almost an hour with me, I do not have that dexterity. So kudos to him. And yet, out of all of his catalog that's significant globally, that's number 27 out of, quite a few, 158. So still quite highly ranked, within his things, but... So go back to this crib sheet, you can see, of course it did well because it's a successful song, but it's didn't break into the top 20 even in every country. And then the actual percentage of revenue here, it's 2,891 as compared to Lose Yourself, which is basically 25,000. So as I said before, the most successful things in the music industry are very top heavy. So let's go back up here to the overall histogram. What I love about the Eminem example is how the histogram can kind of give you a snapshot of the music industry in a way. So if you look through different artists in the system, then they'll have some wildly different patterns, but they all have an interesting story to discover in them. So Eminem, spanning the full time span, his career got going right around the year 2000, this end of the 90s. You can see in this pre-digital era, I believe the iPod came out in 2004, something like that. So in physical media era, of course, early in his career, albums and singles both are making tons of money, albums much more than singles. And then there's a break here where his career, he had a hiatus, and then as he returns, you can see it steadily grows over the last 20 years, basically. Over the last 10 years. And there are a couple of things that I find really interesting here. So first of all, if you look at this half of the graph, which would be the digital era, I believe it was 2015, sorry, not 2015, 2005, 2007, somewhere around there. My goodness, I've totally forgotten. Anyway, Spotify was invented right around here. It was not available in North America until a few years later, somewhere around like 2010. And then also Apple Music grew out of iTunes, and over the last decade and change, streaming services, of course, have grown exponentially around the world, not just in number of countries where it's available, but also subscribers within each country. And you can see each of these things kind of follows a similar pattern. There are some blips when something new came out, but in the years when nothing was happening for the artist's career, like that's kind of the same shape every year. So we had some colleagues dig into these patterns and find how this reflects basically cultural listening patterns. Some of these humps come about 3/4 or halfway through, and some of those reflect, you can really see it in the Bob Marley page. It reflects what people are listening to in the summer, so it's party music and kind of back to school season, because so much was driven by, I guess has always been the case with the music industry, so much was driven by the youth, you could say anyone under 30, that back to school habits have a really big impact on this. The other really interesting thing is that even though conventional industry wisdom, as I may have already said, tells us that artists now are just raking in more money than ever before in the industry, if you're looking at just the recording revenue, these humps here, like this volume, is much lower than before. And I don't have a hard reference for this, so you will want to fact check me. But I'm pretty sure that this is because this is almost all digital now, and the royalty rates of this are abysmal. Also really interesting to me is that you would think singles would be so much more prevalent in what we could think of as the song download era. I know kind of late 90s, early 2000s, as the industry changed, that was a big topic of conversation about how song downloads was kind of like the death of the album. That's maybe a little overdramatic or oversimplifying, but it definitely changed the landscape of how people engage with music still, and how people are conceiving of releases and putting things together. So we've almost backtracked to how it was in the early days of the industry of rock and roll for 50s and 60s, where you have people putting out singles, and then it's kind of like a collection of singles that are packaged together into an album with some filler that's released as the album. Certainly not universally, but it's weird how it like circled back to that in some cases, especially for pop. So you would think that you'd have a lot more revenue coming from singles, but except in the case of the tippy top singles, a lot more is coming from albums, which I find really interesting. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers revenue. So let's move on to impact. Impact, as I said, is the most global of all of these. So it's similar to revenue in that we're doing global calculations of success on a song, artist, and album basis. But unlike revenue, it's not limited to commercial success. So as you'll see, we're looking at things like cultural awards given, inductions into Hall of Fame, and so on. So we're looking at the overall spread and relevance culturally of some of these different artists. Now this website, Impact, has so much information in it that I could spend an hour just talking about this. So I'm going to give you the whistle-stop tour through what's here and just kind of point you in some of the directions that you can go as you hunt and play through it. And one thing that I'd like you to think about as we're going through this, because I find Impact to be a great object lesson in this, think about how the way in which data is framed affects the output. So of course, you want to think of numbers and these calculations with an algorithm as being very objective, but the methodology and the different avenues of attack drastically affect the output. So in fact, it's an incredibly subjective process. So this can be, I think, can be a useful tool for introducing some of these concepts to students in the classroom for a data science purpose or just general critical thinking purposes. And there's a really great example of that with albums. So let's go here first. This albums page, similar to revenue, is looking at the most successful, or I should say most influential albums of all time. By our calculations, that would be the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from 1967. And in the right-hand column, as you can see, is relevant sourcing. There's more detail of that elsewhere on the website, but this is the snapshot. So it's not just chart success, it's also things like Grammy Hall of Fame, Guinness World Records, Library of Congress artifact. So there's a lot going into this. This particular table is looking at basically the entire history of recorded music. it goes back to the year 1900. In this case, for albums, only 1950s, because the albums didn't really exist as such before then. We'll see differently on the songs page. So this page, like the revenue homepage, would be the full time ranking. And then you can also, for example, click on this year, and you can see the full rankings just of this year, 1967. And then using the menu at the top, you could choose other years in the 60s, or click the word 1960s here and get the calculation for the decade as a whole, or you can choose other decades and then go into individual years. So there's a lot of detail to pick through. So let's compare two angles that we've calculated albums from and how that compares with songs. So we have top albums, but then if we go to album artists, as you read in the description here, it's not that distinct of a question. So it's thinking what is the artist with the most influential album, as opposed to which album is the most successful. So even just saying that, you can hear how it's a slight rephrasing of basically the same issue. So in this case, he's explaining, he being the mathematician Steve Houghton who did the work on this. So he's explaining the position of each artist in this list reflects the way the charts are combined and the available album charts. So one of them is a little bit more commercially oriented and the other is a little bit more holistically, culturally oriented. So comparing the top three, let's say, we still get the same number 1, but then we have Rolling Stone's Sticky Fingers at number 2, and Elvis compilation of number 1 hits at number 3. If we go back to the generic question of top albums, as opposed to album artists, we have Beatles number 1, Michael Jackson Thriller at number 2, and the Beatles again in number 3. So reframing the question gives a really big impact on the rankings. And let's compare that with songs. So in our songs list, this is looking at the overall life of a song. So I think not coincidentally, it favors older songs because they've had more time to gain more influence. So the number 1 song by our calculation would be Bing Crosby's White Christmas from 1942. And this is looking at everywhere that the song has gotten around. So this is every year that it's on the radio at Christmas. It's in every Christmas album compilation. It's in soundtracks. It has had, 80 years basically to get around. Scrolling down, if we look at some of the other years, then number 2, we've got, somewhat bizarrely, I think, Bryan Adams, Everything I Do, I Do It For You. I don't mean bizarrely like our calculations are questionable. It's just bizarre that this is the number 2 song globally. If you remember the 90s, then you know this song was everywhere. It was in every movie. I don't know why. Bryan Adams was just completely ubiquitous, and clearly he has had, for better or worse, a huge influence on the world of music. But going down, you see most of the dates are not super recent. We've had 90s, 50s, 98. It is not until position 12 that we get anything from the 21st century. And of course, here we have our old friend Eminem with what's easily his most successful or most famous song, Lose Yourself, from the 8 Mile soundtrack. Let me go to song artist for the contrast. So song artist is looking at song from the perspective of just the basic release of the single. So the number 1 for that is Hey Jude by the Beatles, and that is just the original release. It's not its inclusion in the anthologies or soundtracks. It's purely the single. So it's a very different result from the overall songs, but you can see how that's distinct from albums, because a song can get around in different, it can be like a song is just one piece that can be repackaged into other things, but you can't do that with an album, just like you can't put one whole book into other whole books. It's simply not possible with the medium. And then song years, this would be more similar to revenue, I suppose, where it's the top song of a given year. We have just the list of them going here up through 2023, and if you click on the year, you'll get, as we looked at with the albums, you can look at all the top songs of that year and continue to navigate through decades or other specific years. Some of the really fun things, just to get into some of the kind of Easter eggs of the site, you could say, are like these regional hit charts. So I really like these regional and distinctive song pages. And this will be an example of how you can spend hours getting lost in this site. So the regional hits is visualizing essentially how much one region factored into the success of a song. And then you have, if you look at these years, you'll get lists of songs and how their success was in particular regions, basically. I don't know how to say it more clearly than that right now. So we don't have country-specific data so much, but you can get an idea of maybe how much of the pie came from one area or another. And we can see that also in the artist page, as we'll get to in just a moment. And similarly, the distinctive song pages is pretty fun. And so as I said before, like it tends to, Francophone markets tend to be a lot more unique. And so this distinctive song page is looking at things that were massive, massive hits in one place and completely unknown anywhere else. And a lot of times you'll find that it's French language, Scandinavian, or Canadian, weirdly. I don't understand how English language things from Canada don't seem to cross the border into the rest of North America. They're not that different from any other American music, but here we are, tons of regional Canadian hits. So this is like an overall ranking, again, but you can also get into the nitty-gritty, as with all these pages, of individual years. So that's pretty fun to poke around. But let's go back to some of the basics of navigation here. So if you click on a song title, in most cases you will get a list of other notable or significant versions of the song. So for example, Wilson Pickett had a successful cover of Hey Jude in 1969. And then if you went to White Christmas, for example, you would have a ton of ones because it's been covered a bunch of times. And then, like with Revenue, if you go to the Beatles, you'll get a list of the recordings that feature in Into Impact. So this is songs, but from the albums chart, you would get a list of albums. And the song titles is another sort of aberration. I don't think there's not an equivalent for the albums, but this is actually just looking at what are the most common words in songs as a song title. So in this case, Crazy is the most common song title. Gnarls Barkley is listed because that's simply the most successful of the Crazies. But if you click Crazy, then you can see the whole list of everything notable that's been called Crazy, and there are 48 of them. For sourcing, if you look at song charts or album charts, that's giving you the information that went into this. So it's not only the charts, it's also Library of Congress, sheet music sales. For some of the earlier music, let's go back to that quickly in songs, because that's also an interesting issue of data and framing. So song years, we go back to the 1900s with this. As you would expect, the music industry was, of course, much more limited then. It was really just the United States and Spanish language markets, so Spain and some of South America and Brazil, so Portuguese market. So that's reflected, of course, in the recordings. For example, you've got Hiawatha, the song to Menihana. You've got Sousa marches and things like that. It is quite Stars and Stripes Forever, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. So this is all very, not even just Anglo-centric, it's US-centric. And then as you get into future decades, let's jump ahead to the 20s, then you'll see the variety of sources grow and the number of countries spread through the industry grow, and that will affect what's included here. And let's go back to the homepage to wrap things up so you can see some of the other bits and pieces that are in this site. So these facts will answer some of the questions you might have about how did we get this information? Why did you frame it this way? But there's also a lot of just fun stuff, like what's the #1 song on the day I was born? There's a little widget here, so you don't even have to go to the charts to look it up. This is also a really useful one that I didn't go back to. So there's also the guides and how you read the pages. There's so many visualizations. The data in the site is quite dense. I'm going to go back to album artist to give you a better example. So if I go to the Beatles, you see in the upper right corner, you've got a histogram like from revenue, and then this map or this cloud of countries. So the histogram is, again, just a visual shortcut to how much money was brought in at what time. And then the profile, the regional profile is showing you how much a given region weights into this particular artist's success. So to conclude, here's one other fun tidbit that has a lot of dense visualizations. So as we looked at before, song titles is looking at the prevalence of certain words, what are the most popular words in song titles, and this is going into more detail into the same question. So we have the most frequent words in song titles, not the full title, but just words that occur in it. In addition to how many words are in title, the statistics of what is the average number of words in a title, and so forth. You can see this cool visualization shows you how that changes. And then there's more historical context. You can see, just at a glance here, there is a ton of information here. This is plotting the relevance or the relative impact of different media and how things are affecting revenue streams and general influence. So I think, actually, as I was saying before, as I recall, it's more touring that's generating revenue now than the actual recordings. So I hope you have a good idea of what's here. There's certainly so much that it's hard to encapsulate all of it, but I hope you've got a good orientation to use the basics of the songs and artist and what's there, and then have an idea of all the plethora of fun things that there are to pick through here at your leisure. So we certainly encourage you to do that. As always, please do get in touch with us with any questions, or if you need help or just want to know, is something available on here? We'll do our best to answer it, and we hope you have fun playing with the 3 modules. So thanks a lot for listening.